Welcome to the 7th episode of Science, A Peculiar History, the 4th and final episode in a mini-series on Mary Toft. Last time, we started talking about the 1720s media's response to the Mary Toft case, and their treatment of the physicians Nathaniel St. Andre, James Douglas, Richard Manningham, and Cyriacus Ahlers, and also the amateur astronomer Samuel Molyneux, who'd gone to Godalming to try his hand at preternatural obstetrics. Another figure, who I've not actually mentioned yet, since he wasn't that important in the case itself, but who I'm about to mention at least a bit because he was one of the main people who the press took the piss out of, was John Maubray. He'd recently published a book titled The Female Physician, containing all the diseases incident to that sex in virgins, wives and widows, together with their causes and symptoms, their degrees of danger and respective methods of prevention and cure, to which is added the whole art of new improved midwifery, comprehending the necessary qualifications of a midwife, and particular directions for laying women in all cases of difficult and preternatural births, together with the diet and regimen of both the mother and child. I'll just call it The Female Physician from now on. And it broadly covered, in Mowbray's own special way, the topic of obstetrics and gynecology, and was known especially for Mowbray's description of an incident when, passing through the Netherlands on his way home from Germany, he was on a boat across the Zuiderzee, from Harlingen to Amsterdam. A fellow passenger had gone into labour, and Mowbray, being a renowned physician, was called upon to help with the delivery. The woman gave birth not only to a normal human baby, but also to a delightful little Dutch creature known as a sooterkin, or de zoger, which I'm told means the sucker. Mowbray describes it as a monstrous little animal, the likest of anything in shape and size to a moody-warp, having a hooked snout, fiery sparkling eyes, a long round neck, and an acuminated short tail, of an extraordinary agility of feet. At first sight of the world's light, it commonly yells and shrieks fearfully, and, seeking for a lurking hole, runs up and down like a little demon. The creature on the boat ran around screaming for a bit, until some other passengers, Dutch people for whom this kind of thing was apparently an everyday occurrence, managed to kill it. Mowbray claimed that, according to some of the most learned men of the several famous universities in these provinces, this happens to almost 2/3 of the seafaring and meaner sort of Dutch mothers, but presumably it wasn't actually commonplace in the Netherlands for women to give birth to demons that run around screaming until you kill them, which sort of suggests Mowbray just made it up. Indeed, in a pamphlet by James Douglas responding to The Female Physician, he says, "I have discoursed with the Dutch midwives and nurses about this animal, but they are all clear to give their affidavits that it has no existence in nature." The notion of de zoger was not, however, simply an invention of Mowbray's. If we go all the way back to 1559, we get a description from the Dutch physician Levinus Lemnius that sounds very similar to Mowbray's story. He talks about a patient of his, a sailor's wife, giving birth, and I'm using the translation from the Latin by Valerie Worth-Stilianu, from the excellent website birthingtales.org. The woman first, with great suffering and much distress, expelled a certain lump of flesh which was quite shapeless. I surmised that she had conceived this after she had already conceived a fetus legitimately. On both sides of this heavy lump were 2 long handles like arms, and it moved and seemed to be in some way animate, like sponges and sea urchins, which in our region are called elchouve. We see great numbers of them floating in the sea in summer, and once they are pulled out of the water they slide along amazingly, and if they are handled for a long time, they dissolve. Shortly after this, there came from the womb a monster with a hooked beak, a long round neck, eyes which moved from side to side, a long pointed tail, and feet which ran fast. As soon as it saw the light, the monster started to make a great din, running all over the room and trying to hide itself somewhere. But finally the women caught it, and with cushions and pillows suffocated it. Because this sort of monster had drunk all the blood of the child, it is called a leech, saucher in our language. Finally, this woman gave birth to a boy who had been so injured and torn apart by this monster that he survived only a short time after being baptized. The English got hold of stories like this pretty quickly in the 16th and 17th centuries, calling the creature a sooterkin, which, while it sounds like just about the most Dutch word imaginable, is only ever used in English sources. Possibly intended as a joke at the expense of Dutch women, who traditionally used to put small stoves under their skirts to keep their feet warm, the English came up with the idea that these bizarre things developed through the effect of the heat from these stoves. In the English midwife Jane Sharp's 1671 work, The Midwife's Book, she associates de Zauche with other European stories of monstrous births of non-human creatures. As for monsters of all sorts to be formed in the womb, all nations can bring some examples. Worms, toads, mice, serpents, Gordonius saith, are common in Lombardy, and so are those they call sooterkins in the Low Countries, which are certainly caused by the heat of their stoves and menstrual blood to work upon women that have had company with men. And these are sometimes alive with the infant, and when the child is brought forth these stay behind, and the woman is sometimes thought to be with child again, as I knew one there myself, which was after her childbirth delivered of two like serpents, and both run away into the burg wall as the women supposed, but it was at least 3 months after she was delivered of a child, and they came forth without any loss of blood, for there was no afterburden. Again, in time of copulation, imagine ofttimes produceth monstrous births, when women look too much on strange objects. This last sentence ties all these stories in with the theory of maternal impressions, which was a belief that most people seem to have largely taken for granted at the time. But Sharp is also talking in strictly naturalistic physiological terms. This account of a woman giving birth to serpents falls in the middle of a generally very reasonable chapter on molar pregnancies. And this is a pregnancy complication where the cells that would normally become the placenta instead become a large growth in the uterus. In many cases there's no fetus at all, and when there is one it's almost never viable. It's sometimes said that these are what sooterkin stories are talking about. There are similarities, but, as a paper that I found by A.W. Bates points out, the descriptions of sooterkins that we have don't seem to be of things that would look similar to a hydatidiform mole, which would be a fairly indeterminate mass of flesh. Also, that sooterkins are often accompanied, as in Maubray's account, by normal live births, which would be extremely unusual for a hydatidiform mole, and thirdly that hydatidiform moles were well understood at the time, as we can in fact see in Jane Sharp's book, that talks about them as a separate but related phenomenon to the sooterkin. Maubray also talks about moles and sooterkins as separate phenomena. Section 7 of The Female Physician has a whole chapter titled Of Moles, which Maubray also asserts are particularly common in the Netherlands, while de Zauche is discussed in a chapter of the same section titled Of Various Deformed Conceptions, following the chapter Of Monsters, where he is in fact talking about very severe birth defects, of which he asserts that such prodigies, or rather demonical illusions, may appear, as well as monstrous births happen, by the will and pleasure of the great Creator, who would thereby signify and portend something extraordinary, or more than natural to us mortals. Mowbray's other category, various deformed conceptions, groups de Zocher together with less severe birth defects, which he says are most often caused by an impure and unseasonable copulation, such as is not only precisely forbid by the express word of God, but also repugnant to right reason and even to common sense. And the precise perverse and disgusting sex act he's talking about is clarified by a citation to Leviticus 15:24. If a man has sexual relations with her and her monthly flow touches him, he will be unclean for 7 days. Any bed he lies on will be unclean. Interestingly, Maubray, in his discussion of deformities, doesn't at any point consider maternal impressions as a potential cause. He instead seems to greatly prefer to talk in terms of abnormal births as examples of divine agency, either, in the case of deformed conceptions, as punishments for the sin of period sex, or, in the case of monstrous births, as divine portents intended as warnings to humanity. On account of his sooterkin story, John Maubray had become known as the Sooterkin Doctor. He was one of many people who had visited Mary Toft in Lacey's Banyo. He'd only visited once on December the 4th, when the crowd had been eagerly awaiting another rabbit for 5 days. But in Hogarth's Cuniculari, he's there, in the mock nativity scene with the patient at the centre, labelled as the Sooterkin Doctor Astonished. Eyes turned skyward as if in a religious ecstasy, saying simply, "A sooterkin!" And another engraving, The Surrey Wonder by George Virtue, illustrating a play of the same title, shows him entering the room where Saint Andre is delivering a rabbit, holding up a bottle that we can only assume contains some kind of sooterkin, maybe preserved in alcohol or something. Given that he had such little direct involvement in the Mary Toft affair, it's perhaps not totally fair that the media associated him so closely with it. On the other hand, the affair became to some extent a vehicle for more generally mocking the credulity of the medical establishment, of which Mowbray's Dutch sooterkin anecdotes were another prominent example. So in that way it makes complete sense that Maubray would become intimately associated in the popular imagination with Toft. The pamphlet, A Letter from a Male Physician in the Country in response to the author of The Female Physician in London, plainly showing that for ingenuity, probity, and extraordinary productions, he far surpasses the author of the narrative, to which is added a short dissertation upon generation, whereby every childbearing woman may be satisfied that 'tis as impossible for women to generate and bring forth rabbits, as 'tis impossible for rabbits to bring forth women. Written in character as a less well-known physician, writing with mock-fawning admiration for Maubray, explicitly draws a comparison between Maubray and Saint Andre. Sir, since nobody has hitherto pretended to account for it, that you would be so good as to account for this remarkable delivery, as you have elegantly done for many yet more remarkable events in your time. Tell us particularly, learned sir, how these rabbits were generated, and whether you think they were stopped in the fallopian tubes, as His Majesty's anatomist has wisely hinted, or whether you think they were bred in utero, and forget not to tell us how they came there. For out of the uterus he certainly brought forth the head of a preternatural rabbit, with the fur on it, and delivered her of the entire trunk of a rabbit stripped of its skin, of about 4 months' growth. This letter is followed by a fictionalized account of the origins of the hoax, told as a dialogue between a noblewoman and Mary Toft's mother-in-law, Anne, here called Margaret, which was in fact the name of Mary Toft's sister-in-law, who is here described as being a midwife, and has read The Female Physician. Lady, prithee, dame, speak sparingly of the labours of the learned, and let me know what those are you call wonders. Midwife. First, the language is wonderful, such as neither I nor my deputy comprehend, nay, not a word in 100, and I question whether your top midwives at London understand it. And if it was not ill manners, madam, I might even venture to say your ladyship would be puzzled with 10,000 crambo words that I don't understand. Lady. You surprise me, dame. Is not the book English? Midwife. Yes, madam, it is, and yet I defy your ladyship to understand it. Lady. Well, goody, so much for the language of it. Now tell us what other wonderfuls it contains. Midwife. Wonderful stories of women being turned into men, wonderful conceptions of women without the help of men, wonderful births of women and monstrous little animals, that at the first sight of the world's light made wonderful shrieks, and ran up and down like wonderful little demons, and those none of the better sort the first time he saw them. The first of these, he says, made its wonderful egress filling his ears with wonderful shrieks, and... Lady. These are really wonderful things, goody. Anne goes on to explain how the female physician gave her an idea. Midwife. To be plain with your ladyship, I'll tell you a strange story about some rabbits, perhaps as odd as his sooterkins, for his book gave me the first hint to hatch and contrive ways and means to palm an English rabbit on the world for his Dutch sooterkins. Lady. Prithee do, dear Goody Toft, and thou'lt extremely oblige me. Midwife. Well, has not your ladyship heard of the woman that brought forth so many rabbits, and has not your ladyship seen and read a short narrative of that extraordinary delivery? Lady. Yes, yes, I have. The public have been pestered with that rabbit woman a long time, and I had the curiosity to go see her at the bagnio. Midwife. To tell you the truth, she's my daughter-in-law, that is, my son Joseph's wife, and a sly slut she is, as little as they think of her. But poor thing Files like to come into a great deal of trouble yonder at London, for a silly, senseless whim of mine that came into my head after reading the sooterkin story, etc., in The Female Physician. And I guess this brings us to the question of what the media made of Mary Toft herself. And the answer is that they were absolutely savage. Personally, I like to think of Mary Toft as a sort of anti-establishment hero who'd put herself through tremendous hardship to pull off an extraordinary prank at the expense of Georgian England's high society. And I suspect the contemporary media might have seen her in a similar light if she'd been well-dressed, eloquent, charming, like Claude Duval or Jack Sheppard, or the other dashing rogues that Georgian pop culture idolised. But Mary Toft was profoundly uncharismatic. She was illiterate from the small-town working class, and, perhaps worst of all, a woman. It's a bit odd that for all the media's delight in the humiliation visited on establishment figures like Saint-André, the architect of that humiliation gets virtually no credit at all. Mary Toft is almost entirely presented as, to use the words of one of the ballads, a mere simple tool, being dragged along by people like her husband, her mother-in-law, and John Howard. This coverage generally focuses on presenting Mary Toft as profoundly and impressively stupid, which is an impression a lot of people seem to have had of her, just based on her appearance and how she carried herself. Saint-André himself described her as of a very sullen and stupid demeanour. And that broadside I've mentioned before, with the comic strip, opens with, "Poor Mary Toft in ignorance was bred, and ne'er betrayed a deep designing head." Indeed, the dialogue I gave earlier presents Anne Toft as very much the instigator, with Mary simply being her puppet. One of the accounts of the case, titled Much Ado About Nothing, was written in character as Mary Toft, in what I assume is a parody of a contemporary rural working-class dialect, littered with clumsy misspellings and obviously crude sexual innuendo. Take as an example, "So he treated me with as fine a rawbit as effer I tasted in my born days. Now you must know that his rawbit had an indifferent taste from any I had effer eat. For it was not bilt, nor roasted, nor frickum seed, but tossed up skin and all, with its ears pricked up. However, thank God I got it all down, and thought I never tasted a delicater morsel in my life. My husband had giffen me many and many a raw bit before, but no comparison, so I never after valued his raw bits, no more than nothing at all, but always honed for my neighbour's raw bit. It's not clear whether Mary Toft actually was as stupid as everyone makes out. It was certainly in her interests to make out that she was simply the puppet of her in-laws, especially when the prospect of a criminal prosecution was looming. She could minimise her own agency by playing to the way everyone thought she was a complete idiot. On top of that, it suited the media as well, who wanted to dunk on Saint-André. Emphasising Mary Toft's stupidity made Saint-André seem even more stupid for having been duped by her. Maybe it was part of the act from the beginning. It would have made her seem just more trustworthy, and made it seem less likely that she would be able to pull off an elaborate hoax. Or maybe they were all just being snobby about her working-class accent and mannerisms. Or maybe she actually just was extremely thick. The other thing that's apparent in Much Ado About Nothing is the sexual innuendo, and the sort of insinuation that Mary Toft was some kind of depraved sexual deviant. A satirical poem written anonymously, although Dennis Todd thinks it was most likely actually written by the physician and satirist Dr. Arbuthnot, takes the piss out of this sort of reaction. "Whip," said Sir Thomas, "whip the slut, it is a breach of peace, that woman anything should put but pintles into that place." Pintle being an old word for penis. Here we see the idea again that the anger at Mary Toft was mostly on account of her apparent sexual depravity, although it's certainly Thomas Clarges, the Justice of the Peace, who comes off looking worse here. Indeed, he was weirdly enraged about the whole thing, and Douglas and Manningham had to restrain him from sending Toft straight to prison before they could extract a confession. Mary Toft's femininity, too, was central to the hoax and to its media coverage, and for some of the media, this made it even more humiliating for the doctors who had fallen for it, or who were presented as falling for it. In the ballad that I sang in the last episode, the first verse is, "Most true it is, so dare I say, as since the days of Eve, the weakest woman sometimes may the wisest man deceive." And of course we've got puns on that old pronunciation of Coney, like I mentioned in the last episode, which was all far too convenient to resist. For instance, in the cartoon strip I've referred to a few times, "Strange turn of human life, unhappy Molly is now to Bridewell carried to Mill Dolly. The cunny warren's ruined, and no more must ferrets hunt there as they did before." Or indeed, in the aforementioned ballad, "On tiptoe then the squire he stood, but first he gave her money, then reached as high as e'er he could, and cried, I feel a cunny." Now what became of everyone afterwards? For Douglas, Manningham and Arlers, the affair pretty much blew over. The press moved on to other things, and they continued their medical careers pretty much as they had before. It was another matter for Saint-André. His career and reputation were in ruins. The full account of this discovery, with some considerations on the extraordinary circumstances of this case, never ended up being published. Roger Lacey, the owner of the Bagnio where Mary Toft had stayed, ended up having to sue him for unpaid bills. It came to £57, or about £7,000 in modern currency. Now popularly known as the Rabbit Doctor, Saint-André's life continued to be weird. In 1728, Samuel Molyneux, the amateur astronomer and secretary to the Prince of Wales, who we've already introduced when he visited Mary Toft in Guildford, collapsed in the House of Commons. In spite of Saint-André's ministrations as physician, he died a few days later. Not waiting a moment, the very same night he died, Saint-André eloped with Molyneux's widow. They were married 2 years later. Obviously, the suspiciously convenient timing of Molyneux's death gave rise to rumours that Saint-André had poisoned him. While there wasn't enough evidence to actually prosecute him for murder, this only did further damage to his already shattered reputation. Generally, it's not a good look for a doctor if everyone thinks they're in the habit of murdering their patients in order to steal their wives. He actually won a defamation lawsuit, but still was never able to recover his prestige as a physician, which, to be fair, was improbable to begin with. Him and his wife, Elizabeth, moved to Southampton and lived in quiet obscurity on Elizabeth's inherited wealth, until Elizabeth died, his house burned down, and he lost all his money in some bad investments. He died in an almshouse in 1776, aged 93. Howard also came off badly. He was charged with conspiring with Mary Toft, and the case ended up being moved to the King's Bench, the highest court in England. He was bound over for £400, or about £47,000 in modern currency. In the end, the case was dropped. Howard returned to Guildford and continued to practice medicine. I suppose he had less to lose than Saint-André, being less closely involved with London high society and court intrigues, where reputation counted for everything, so he was to some extent able to recover his career. As for Toft herself, she was released from Bridewell after 4 months in April 1727, without charge. While the evidence that she had carried out the hoax was unquestionable, Karen Harvey points out that a prosecution for fraud would require evidence that she had actually profited in some way. There's plenty of discussion of potential financial gain as a motivation. In the words of Dennis Todd, giving birth to rabbits was an uncommon but not unreasonable way to make money in the 18th century. But the evidence that any money actually changed hands is limited to a single mention of Arla's, who didn't actually believe her in the first place, so can hardly be said to have been defrauded, giving her a guinea. Arla's said that Howard asked for a pension from the king, but there's no smoking gun that proves the Tofts themselves had the same idea. The other reason that the case was thrown out was that the affair had been very embarrassing for a lot of important people, not least the king himself, who had been sending all these doctors to Guildford, and the press interest was starting to die down. Bringing it all back up again for a trial that would go into great detail about how they'd all fallen for such a blatant scam was the last thing they wanted. Indeed, the motive remains a bit of an open question. I think it's probably most plausible that the Tofts were after a royal pension or some other financial gain, maybe charging people to watch in a setup a bit like the freak shows that were popular at the time. But like I said, there's no smoking gun. I kind of like the idea, even if it's a bit more far-fetched, that they just thought it would be funny. In one strange episode, while Mary Toft was in prison, a newspaper printed what they claimed was her suicide note, also seeming to confuse her with her mother-in-law, Anne Toft. I, Anne Toft, finding myself in the hands of justice and could by no means get from it, I took this method to rid myself of so great a torment which I must have suffered in this world, the matter being of my own contrivance from the very first, hoping to get some money of the country people to help to maintain me under so pretended a misfortune. But little thought it would come to so great a head as it did. So hoping to recover more mercy from God than I deserve, I depart this world fell of confusion. Presumably at some point someone would figure out that Mary Toft actually wasn't dead, and also wasn't called Anne, but I suppose by that point people would still have bought the paper, so it wouldn't matter. We don't hear much about Mary Toft after that. She returned to Godalming, became pregnant again in 1728, leading to a bit of media speculation, but resulting in no doubt crushing disappointment when the baby turned out to be a human. In 1740 she was apparently arrested again for receiving stolen goods, and she remained at least a bit notorious for decades afterwards. She was apparently invited to dinners at the Duke of Richmond's residence in Godalming for his guests to gawk at her, and in 1762 she appeared in the foreground of Hogarth's print Credulity, Superstition and Fanaticism, lying back with a strange, tortured expression, amid mocking depictions of witches, demons and religious fanatics, with a line of rabbits bounding out from between her legs. And then, in 1763, she died in Godalming, aged 62. The entry for her burial in the parish register reads, January the 13th, Mary Toft, widow, the impostoress rabbit breeder. That's all on Mary Toft. Thank you for listening. Keep an eye on the podcast's social media channels on Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky and the website formerly known as Twitter for details of the next mini-series.